Greetings, welcome back. My name is Cameron Miller, and this is a sermon for the second Sunday of Pentecost, proper 5 if you use the lectionary, and a story about Jesus and the tax collector. But here's a little riddle first. What is more powerful and influential in creating social change than laws or money? And yet, rarely, if ever, is it used by advocates for change? Well, here's another clue. What is the public and communal equivalent of sexual intimacy? All right, last clue. What is the single most powerful bonding experience we can engage in as family and friends and social cohorts like a church? You've probably already guessed that I'm talking about eating together. And you probably know most, if not all, of what I'm about to talk about. But it's been a while since we've invited a tax collector to our table, so here it is again. We take eating together utterly for granted, unless, of course, we eat alone and have to cook for ourselves on a regular basis. Eating together is the single most powerful social activity that we do or do not do. As a society, we do not eat together. We eat separately in our segregated communities, just as we live separately. And apparently, we do not even eat together while living in the same household, according to a bunch of social research. Parents and children apparently sleep in the same house, but often do not eat together in the same place or at the same time. Yet, if there is one exercise that a household can engage in to create greater social cohesion, it would be to eat together. And beyond private households, if we regularly ate together with people across social and economic, ethnic, and racial boundaries, we would have greater social cohesion and a very different society. But don't take my word for it. Listen to this little squib from anthropologist Peter Farb. Quote, "In all societies, both simple and complex, eating is the primary way of initiating and maintaining human relationships. Once the anthropologist finds out where, when, and with whom the food is eaten, just about everything else can be inferred about the relations among society's members. To know what, where, how, when, and with whom people eat is to know the character of their society." Now, I got that as an excerpt from Jesus, a Revolutionary Biography by John Dominic Crossan. So it's far easier to observe the power of eating together in a society like the one Jesus lived in than our own. In first century Judah and Galilee, the rules and the norms for the social contract were much clearer and far more pronounced than our own. Jesus' society was intensely hierarchical, with older men generally at the apex of the pyramid, and children and slaves generally at the bottom. But within that order, social positioning and public credentials also situated an individual along the hierarchy. So men did not eat with women, and they did not eat with children, period. Jews did not eat with Gentiles, and they didn't eat with other Jews who were not within their social caste. Those who were ritually pure did not eat with those who were impure, whether their impurity was from their profession or a lack of scrupulous religious observance. Those who were well did not eat with those who were not well, and wellness was determined by something as small as a blemish on the skin, like acne, that could be considered an outward and visible sign of a hidden depravity, or a more grave illness that was regarded as a punishment for moral deficiency. In short, in Jesus' world, You only associated with people like yourself, and you avoided physical contact with anyone who did not inhabit your shelf in the social hierarchy. Which brings into focus all the more the radical nature of Jesus' behavior. But before we think about Jesus, I want to think about and consider ourselves. We may not have the same rigid social hierarchy, but in fact, by practice, we are nearly as segregated by socioeconomic and racial caste as was Jesus' world. In some ways, we're more segregated because in the Roman Empire, in Jesus' day, the concept of race did not exist. It's interesting to note, I think, that the modern concept of race, it is a modern concept, that one's skin color determines one's humanity, is a social concept that enters the scene during the Enlightenment, the so-called Age of Reason. There seems to be a great deal about the age of reason that turns out to be unreasonable. Anyway, in Jesus' day, ethnicity carried a lot of weight, but it was a very polyglot world, and society was stratified by socio and economic caste, and in each of those castes, the ethnicity could be very diverse. When we look at our own behavior as 21st century North Americans, we observe the practice of rural, urban, suburban, and ex-urban segregation by class, race, and ethnicity. And within the span of that larger geographic segregation, there is micro segregation into neighborhoods or areas or streets or roads even. Now, I loved it when I lived over on the corner of Washington Street and Pine Street. On the blocks of Washington near where I used to live, it was a leafy stretch of mostly affluent houses. Pine Street, though, was full of rentals, small single-family homes, and student houses. It was also the pass-through from the corner of William and Pulteney, where there lived an extended Hispanic community. So it felt less segregated than Washington Street actually is. But everything about our housing and banking policies and practices nourishes segregation by caste, though we don't call it caste. So when we listen to what Jesus says and does, we should not imagine that his world was all that different from ours. And with that in mind, let's peek at that little story from Matthew. First of all, it's widely presumed that the place to which Jesus led Matthew, the tax collector, was back to Jesus' own house. I know that we do not think of Jesus as having a house, but there are references to his having a home and presumably some kind of carpentry or workshop in it in the city of Capernaum. When my own house and mortgage get me down, I really enjoy the thought of Jesus as a homeowner. It makes him less romanticized. Misery loves company. Anyway, Jesus takes the tax collector to his house and he sits him down at his dining room table, which actually they would have reclined on pillows, and Jesus feeds him food from out of his own cupboard. Now let me say a word about the tax collector. We're not talking about an IRS auditor or someone working for the state of New York. Remember, Jesus' little world was occupied by a foreign military force, a massive conquering empire. Tax collectors were the people who collaborated with those occupiers. They collected painful and ruinous amounts of tax for travel, for land, for commerce, all of which made a precarious existence all the more difficult. Not only did the tax collectors charge whatever amount the empire set for that particular economic activity, but they also added a surcharge from which they became wealthy. So you see, the tax collectors collaborated with the enemy to the benefit of themselves at the cost of their own people. They were exploiters. Tax collectors were hated. Hated. Jesus invites one of them home and feeds him. That would be just one more nail in Jesus' social coffin. Jesus earned the reputation of a disreputable host, and that meant he had an invisible inscription pinned on his back. Don't be seen in his house, because he invites people there who will ruin your reputation too. He eats with people who will lower your standing on the hierarchy, people who will make you unclean, people who will ruin you. Remember what that anthropologist wrote: to know what, where, how, when, and with whom people eat is to know the character of the society. Jesus' character was besmirched by who he ate with, by who he invited into his house to sit at his table, and with whom he engaged in the intimate act of eating. So we see that Jesus' behavior threatened a social order that was woven together with a strong fabric of clear and rigid expectations and standards. There were linear boundaries that had no elasticity, and so would break if stretched too far by too many. Now, when was the last time our character was besmirched by who we ate with? When was the last time anyone could be scandalized by who we invited into our homes? If social order is created and maintained by who we eat with and how and where we eat, our social order, because it is essentially unjust and inequitable, needs our subversiveness. Our subversiveness around the table, around our own dining room tables, as well as around the table here at Trinity Place and in other places of worship. If Jesus is our model for what the love of God looks like, when practiced in the real world by real people, then our spiritual practice begins with this table here and how we extend it and who we share food with. I mean, we have a nice little ritual that we do, like a lot of churches, that we've been doing for thousands of years. But it's a symbolic ritual that points to something bigger. Don't just snack on this wafer and wine, Jesus might say to us. Feast with one another and bring others into the feast. That's what this means. Now, I know that we are bright, imaginative, and creative people. I do not need to spell out the implications for us of Jesus' disreputable behavior and of the composition of his dining room or kitchen table. We do well as individuals and as congregations to revisit our own ideas about spirituality, about social cohesion, about strategies for social change, as well as our ideas about what makes for strong community and strong family systems. We would do well to begin to look at all that through the lens of Jesus' practice of hosting and being a guest around tables that included people who crossed boundaries to eat with one another. Someone might respond that I'm making much ado about eating. But really, when we think about it, when it comes to Jesus, it's almost all about eating together. Peace be with you. Thanks for being here. was beautiful, Lisa.